Hi everyone, just a quick intro into what I'm doing and why. In this time of social distancing, I began to think of my mom and my husband's aunt and anyone else who is isolated and don't have the means to get out of or interact with people. Both my mom and aunt were avid readers before age took their eyesight. So I thought, what better way to connect with people like them than to sit in front of you and read to those who can't read for themselves anymore. So I'm going to open this book and read a chapter a day for them and anyone else who'd like to listen. Now, a little background. After watching my own mother suffer with mental illness for years, and me being a victim advocate dealing with domestic violence for almost 5 years, I began to view the world of abuse with a different perspective. Physical abuse has been brought into the forefront of discussion and is finally being dealt with, analyzed, and treated. But it's the hidden world of emotional abuse, whether real or imagined, that stays in the shadows unseen, unrecognized, and for many people not believed. Sometimes the worst kind of abuse can only be seen when someone takes the time to look beyond the facade and see the bruises behind the eyes. Synopsis. Jody Warren is a young mother who married a man too much like her father. From the day they were wed, Doug's emotional abuse and control began to slowly eat away at her sense of reality. Being raised by a father who was verbally abusive, her husband's behavior was Jody's abnormal normal. But after tragedy befalls the family, her mental state deteriorates quickly until her mind becomes trapped in a fantasy world of her own. Jody's struggle is if she can find the strength to differentiate fantasy from reality in time to save herself and her children. This is entitled To Trap a Tortured Soul by Pamela Manresa. Prologue. When they first met, he told her she was pretty and it made her feel special. But after they were married, he told her she was rather ordinary and she believed him. On their wedding day, people gushed at what a beautiful bride she was, so he showered her with passionate attention. But on the wedding night, he made her sleep on the hotel sofa, telling her that she had embarrassed him and had acted vain, and she believed him. One time, he told her she had a unique way of looking at life and she was elated. But later, when he told her she was worthless and didn't have enough intelligence to have her own opinion, she believed him. When their first child was born, he told her she was a good mother and it made her feel proud. But after child number 3, he told her that her parenting skills were pathetic and she didn't deserve their respect. Her heart dropped to her feet, but she believed him. Then one day, when he told her she was a good wife, she wanted to believe him. But later, when he berated her for being lethargic and lazy, telling her that if she was going to walk around half dead, she should just give in to the impulse, she believed him that time too. Section 1. Family and Friends. Family and friends, friend and enemy. You can't know one without knowing any. Chapter 1. The Father. Sheriff Callum was tired, so very tired. For the last week, he had organized search parties, made phone calls, wrangled volunteers, and dealt with the family of a woman who, for lack of a better explanation, had simply vanished. Jody Warren, 36-year-old wife and mother on vacation with her husband and children, had disappeared 4 days into their family vacation in the uppermost western corner of Washington state. Following the first 24 hours of searching by him and his staff, which proved fruitless, Callum had organized search parties with the help of other agencies in the state. 1 day later, her disappearance ended up in the local paper. After another day and a half, her husband had informed his in-laws in St. Cloud, Minnesota. 36 hours after that, the search had been called off because of weather. Sheriff Calvin had been dealing with Mrs. Warren's husband, Doug Warren, for a week now, and putting professionalism aside, Callum felt that the man had been proven to be about as much help as a tick on a dog's ass. Doug Warren had provided an explanation of events that had made no sense, and then had given the authorities a description of his wife so vague that Callum was beginning to wonder if the man ever actually looked at his wife. His description was that she was short, maybe 5'5", skinny but beginning to get on the pudgy side, blonde but not too blonde. What the hell did that even mean, Callum had asked him. Not too blonde. And no one he knew would consider 5'5" for a woman as being short. Jody Warren's kids had been of no more help than the husband. When asked for a description of their mother, one said she was super skinny, while the other said she was tall and kind of fat. The oldest girl was the only one who seemed to be logical, but she was so stoic that an outsider would wonder if she didn't have a social affliction of some kind. The only way Callum knew for sure that even was a Jody Warren was that the owners of the B&B they had stayed at had vouched to her authenticity. But even they seemed confused as to what she looked like. A nice-looking woman, average height, average weight, dirty blonde, blue eyes, no green eyes, or maybe they were hazel. You know, they'd said, average. While Callum had the Kokanee Bay Sheriff's Office work nonstop with every resource at their disposal, the missing woman's family wallowed in the tiny tourist town complaining of delays and substandard results. In the meantime, not one of them could describe what clothes she was wearing the day she disappeared, or even remember the exact time any of them had seen her last. Stranger yet, after 3 days on vacation, not one of them had taken a picture of her. They had pictures of each other, pictures of the wharf, pictures of the local museum, hell, even a picture of the front of the restaurant they had eaten dinner at the night before. But no pictures of a tall, short, skinny, fat, average-looking Jody Warren with color-changing eyes. Callum let these thoughts swirl around in his head while he filed the day's paperwork at 9 in the evening and hoped he would finally be able to go home at least one night that week before midnight. He was so tired his bones hurt and was wondering if he'd even be able to drive home without falling asleep when a loud bang of the front door, office door, started his nervous system. Bending at the waist and looking around his office door like a floating head without a body, he saw a large, red-faced man standing just inside the vestibule. His arms were bowed at his side and his feet braced apart like he was challenging someone to a gunfight at high noon. Taking immediate measure of the man, Callum guessed he stood about 5'10", stout, and from the look in his eyes, really pissed off. He had let the door slam behind him, causing a loud bang, and stood surveying the office, obviously looking for signs of life. Seeing the floating head of Sheriff Callum peeking around the door at the far end of the room, he said loudly, "I want to talk to the sheriff." The heat of his impatience was evident. "I'm Sheriff Callum," Callum announced as he straightened up his body and let his legs realign themselves with his torso as he came around the door. He was 52 years old and stood 6'1". His light-colored hair was just long enough to give an illusion of style, but at the moment stood up in different directions, like he'd tried to rub it off his head. His eyes were a light blue and carried an impressive amount of experience hidden behind layers of fatigue. In contradiction to the disarray of his hair, the short shirt he wore was so crisp and white that the metal star pinned to it stood out like an advertised sign blinking the message, "I'm the man in charge." The angry man stood facing straight ahead, unblinking. His face was as red as the neon sign on the hardware store that could be seen through the large plate glass window at his back. His formidable bearing made him appear larger than he really was, and when he spoke, his soft, saggy jowls jiggled, reminding Callum of a bulldog in overalls. "I'm Joe Olson," he stated his name like it was supposed to be of some importance. "I'm Jody Warren's father." He waited half a heartbeat before he continued. "I just come from the hotel where my son-in-law informed me that you've stopped looking for her. I want to know why." Sheriff Callum expelled his breath in an audible sigh as his shoulders bent ever so slightly forward, like a balloon that had lost some of its air. Reaching to his right, he placed a file he was holding on top of the cabinet behind the door and stood a mirror image of Mr. Olson. He had learned long ago that to appear cooperative and gain someone's trust was to copy their mannerisms. But he also stood firm in front of Mr. Olson because he didn't like to be intimidated, especially in his own office by a belligerent man storming through the door at 9:15 in the evening. Resignation staining his tone, he said, "Mr. Olson, why don't you come on back to my office and have a seat and we'll talk." Mr. Olson walked the 20 feet from the front door to where the sheriff was waiting. He stomped across the room like a general in battle mode. "Can I get you some coffee?" Callum offered as he indicated a chair in front of his desk. "No thanks. I'm here for one reason and one reason only, to find out why you stopped looking for my daughter. Besides that, I've been living off coffee for the past 72 hours. I'm so loaded up with coffee, I may not sleep for a week." "I can certainly understand that." Callum walked around his desk to sit in a large black leather chair that cradled an imprint of his backside from years of use. "Sheriff, I'm not one who believes in beating around the bush. It took me 2 days to close up my glass shop. A day of flying from Minnesota to Seattle, and another day waiting around for a charter flight just to get here. Which, by the way, is so far north in this country, I thought we were flying into Canada. Now I'm tired, broke, and down on my feet, and all I want to know is have you stopped looking for my daughter? To begin with, Mr. Olson, I'm truly sorry about your daughter, and I can understand you're upset. But like I told your son-in-law, we haven't been able to get one solid lead on where she is, or even when she disappeared. In addition to that, neither Mr. Warren nor your grandchildren can even verify with any certainty that the last time they remembered seeing her. I have to tell you, I find that really odd. On top of that, the storm hit the area a couple of days into the search, which hindered our efforts even more. We have to wait for the storm out to sea to clear and hope it's before our resources completely dry up. Resources? Is this about money? My daughter is missing and you're concerned about money? The bite of Mr. Olson's tone had Callum setting his jaw. No, it's not about money, Mr. Olson. Callum silently urged himself to be patient. We've had people from all over the country in to help, as well as the Coast Guard, but even they can't wait forever. Frankly, with or without the storm, the problem is we simply don't know where to look. As I understand it, your daughter and her family were on a ferry headed out to one of the outlying islands, and when the ferry docked, she didn't get off. Mr. Warren went back on the ferry and looked for her, but couldn't find her. He then talked to a couple of Forest Service personnel who maintain the island. They had a look around the island, thinking maybe she had slipped by them and taken one of the trails that led into the woods, but they couldn't find any evidence she had done this. About 4 hours of looking, my office was called in. Joe Olson sat and stared at the sheriff, confusion skewing his forehead as he worked his mouth around like he was slowly chewing taffy, defiance still in his eyes. Callum continued, unfazed by the tight grip Mr. Olson had on the arms of his chair or the comical expression contorting his face. There's a lot of force in that area, and we conducted searches for 3 days and found nothing. We then had to stop when the storm came on. So you didn't find hide nor hair of her before the storm hit? Maybe she fell and is laying where you can't see her. We thought of that, but we didn't find any footprints around the trails or even down on the beach. And frankly, the island just isn't that big. If she were on it, I'm convinced we would have found her before then. Mr. Olson swallowed noticeably hard, as if that imaginary taffy had gotten stuck in his throat, and he had just been able to force it down. His eyes softened around the edges, but he kept his mouth hard as he forced words between tight lips. She has to be somewhere. Callum noticed the softening in Mr. Olson's eyes and added more sympathetically. There is nothing I'd like more than to find your daughter, but we simply don't know where to look. And I don't mean to alarm you any more than I have to, but there is speculation she might have fallen overboard. Mr. Olson looked up sharply, his teeth biting together so hard it sounded like he were crunching bone. Looking down as if lack of eye contact could soften the blow, Callum explained. She wasn't wearing a life vest. We had the ferry company count them. The Coast Guard and some local fishermen searched the surrounding waters but found no trace of her either. No clothes, her hat, nothing she might have had on. If she had fallen overboard, they're convinced they would have found her on that stretch of water the ferry takes because it's a straight line between here and the island. There's no way she ended up in the water, Joe Olson bit out. Doug told me the day had been clear and calm, no wind at all. Now she may not be the brightest of my kids, but she knows how to stay on a damn boat. Choosing to ignore Mr. Olson's biting statement, Callum continued, yes, it was calm that day, but even if the best case scenario, she had fallen overboard and simply got disoriented in the water. Without a vest on, she would have been in serious trouble once the storm hit. Right now, it's only speculation, mind you, but if that had happened, we were convinced someone would have seen her. Besides, the ferries that run that route there are also small fishing boats that use that stretch of water. Yet no one has come forward saying they saw anyone fall off a ferry or calling for help. See, there you go, Olson said, reiterating his point. She didn't fall overboard. Now I'm telling you here and now, she's out on that island or maybe got on the wrong ferry coming back. You just need to ask around. Callum folded his hands before him on the desk and tapped his thumbs together like small cymbals. Well, to tell you the truth, Mr. Olson, for the last week we haven't been able to get a lot of useful information from anyone. We even interviewed some of the other passengers, and not one single person remembers her. And since they only run one ferry a day to that island, she couldn't have gotten on a different one. We just can't confirm at this point if she even got on that one. Mr. Olson leaned forward in his chair. Are you trying to convince me that she simply vanished into thin air? Spittle sprayed from his lips. I can tell you this right now. If she was told to get on that ferry, then she was damn well on that ferry. Jody knows her place. Callum cocked his head back slightly, curiosity clouding his expression. The comment had him leaning his chest against the edge of the desk in direct response to Mr. Olson's aggressive behavior. That may well be, he countered, but I don't know what else to tell you. We have no leads and no clue where to look. Personally, I find the whole thing highly suspicious. Suspicious? Suspicious of who? Doug? There's no reason to be suspicious of Doug. He's a good husband, and if he says he doesn't know where she is, then he doesn't know. I didn't say I was suspicious of Mr. Warren. We vouched for his whereabouts and know he wasn't with her the whole time they were on the ferry. Seems your son-in-law was the life of the boat, so to speak. There were several people who remembered talking to him for the entire ride. But now that you bring him up, I have to say I find it strange how he's responding to this whole thing. If my wife were missing, I wouldn't be as anxious to go back to Minnesota as he appears to be. It's not that he's anxious to go home. I know he's worried sick, but he has to get back to work. He's the vice president of a bank, you know, and he just can't put everything on hold forever. Yes, I know. He's told me several times. But we're not giving up just yet. I do still have some volunteers continuing to look around the Bay Area and the surrounding woods outside of town, just in case she did make it back to shore and is hurt somewhere. But that will have to be stopped by morning if that other storm hits like they're predicting. I promise we'll continue to search as long as we can until weather tells us otherwise. But like I said, without any leads, there's not a whole lot we can do. Mr. Olson sat and stared at the sheriff, his furrowed brow demonstrating the difficulty his brain was having of absorbing the details. His body started to deflate as his shoulders slumped slightly and he leaned back against the chair. He lowered his eyes to the edge of Callum's desk, staring at an unseen spot, worry overcoming his bravado. Sheriff Callum released his own hold on his tensed muscles and leaned back in his chair. I'm truly sorry, Mr. Olson. With a change in the sheriff's tone, Mr. Olson glanced up to see a look of pity aimed at him. Straightening up immediately, he said forcefully, I can tell you now that something must have happened to her. Maybe she is hurt somewhere and got disoriented. Maybe she even made it as far as some hotel or something. Callum reached up and scratched his head as he squeezed his eyes tightly shut, trying to hide his frustration. He scratched the top of his head so hard it looked like he were trying to dig an idea out of his brain, but didn't want to look directly at it when he clawed it out. On a loud, tired sigh, he said, Okay, say that did happen. Say we somehow missed her on the island and the ferry when we researched them, and she did make it back to the town to some hotel. If that were the case, why hasn't she contacted her family to let them know she's okay? This has been in the news for several days. She would have heard we're conducting a search for her and would have come forward before now, don't you think? Well, now, I just may have to disagree with you on that point. Sitting up straighter in his chair, Olson's eyes darted from one corner of the room to the other like he were about to reveal a secret. She may not know anyone is looking for her at all. I don't understand. I'm just saying that she's sometimes a little, I don't know, spacey, I guess you'd say. She doesn't always pay attention to her surroundings at times. Sort of lives in her head. Sheriff Callum gave a surprised humph. Now that's interesting. This is something that might have been mentioned earlier. Picking up a pen, he grabbed a manila folder lying on top of the stack of reports sitting on the corner of his desk, opened it to the first page and started making notes. Okay now, he continued as he started writing without looking up. Are you saying she's forgetful or something? Does she have some kind of mental problem? Listen now, I didn't say she's crazy. You're putting words in my mouth. I'm just saying she may have wandered off by herself and got lost. Why would she do that? Wander off? Yeah, why would she just wander off without telling her family? She likes being outdoors, that's all. Okay, so let me get this straight. You're saying she could have decided to take a hike around the island without letting anyone know she was going, somehow slipped by all the other passengers and the rangers, lost her bearings, and simply got lost? Or better yet, somehow hid on the ferry until it got back to town and wandered off to do some exploring? Yeah, well, something like that, maybe. But as I mentioned, no one even remembers seeing her on the ferry in the first place. Look, Sheriff, I'm just trying to make sense of the whole thing. My wife is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I've had to cancel jobs back home I can't afford to lose, and now my grandkids are looking at me like I'm supposed to fix this whole thing. I'm at the end of my rope. And now what I'm hearing from you is I have to go back to the hotel and tell my wife that you don't have a clue as to where Jody is or even where to keep looking. Callum cocked his head, his patience wearing thinner than his exhaustion. We're going to continue to search, but at this moment, that's about the gist of it. Callum was truly wanting this man out of his office, but maintained his professional demeanor and bit down on his waning patience. Then I'm just wasting my time here, but I know my wife's going to want to talk to you herself. Maybe it'll help her sleep some. Fine, I'd like to talk to your wife myself, Callum matched Mr. Olson's brusque tone. Tell her she can come by around in the morning. Fine. Mr. Olson said roughly and rose abruptly from the chair. The metal tabs on the feet scraped the tiled floor as it slid backward a few inches, causing Callum to cringe in the same way nails on a chalkboard would. Mr. Olson turned and headed for the door without considering the social etiquette of shaking the sheriff's hand. As he turned his back, he mumbled under his breath, "Missing, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it. Making me lose work." Callum wasn't surprised at the man's quick departure. What surprised him were the caustic words he said with enough force that they were carried across the room. Callum wasn't sure if Mr. Olson knew he could hear him. Troublesome girl. Been trouble since the day she was born. Callum watched as the big man stomped from his office and once again let the front door shut with a loud bang. Sitting still as he watched Mr. Olson leave, like the man's departure wasn't a direct slap of rudeness to his position, Callum crossed his hands over his chest and leaned fully back into the leather chair, letting the past 20 minutes wash over his overworked memory. After a few moments of contemplation and with slow determination, Callum pulled himself to an upright position, grabbed a pencil from his desk drawer, and turned the folder on Jody Warren over to the back side. In the bottom left corner, in a spot he was sure no one would think to look, he wrote, "Prick." He always wrote his opinion on the folder of everyone he interviewed as a reminder of how he felt about a person. It helped him remember how someone handled themselves during a crisis or a stressful situation in their life. It was his way of venting without saying a word, and in all the years he'd been an officer, never once had he felt like he had misjudged anyone. He was a good judge of character, and from what he'd seen from one Mr. Joe Olson, his description of him, which was now written in small block letters on the back of the folder, was dead on accurate. To be on the safe side, though, he always wrote his opinion in pencil on the chance he had to erase it if a case went to trial. He didn't want to take the chance of someone seeing his opinion and jeopardizing a case. Slowly, as if he'd just remembered he'd done it, his eyes drifted to the other corner of the folder, the corner he had reserved for Doug Warren, Jody's husband. In the same block letters, he'd written his opinion of this man as well. Narcissist. Callum began to wonder what kind of family this woman had gone missing from, and could only hope her mother would prove to be more, normal. Things with the case of Jody Warren just didn't seem to add up. That's the end of chapter 1. Thank you for listening, and excuse my mistakes. See you tomorrow.